All right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peter Fitness podcast. I do not know how to say my name there. Wow, great intro, Adam.
Great start,
Great
man.
star already. So, welcome back to the Adam Peter Fitness podcast. Today on the show, I have Josh Pelland. I'm pronouncing your last name right, Pelland.
Dude, you nailed it. Usually it's Peland, Pelland, or people will just think that the N is an R, so they'll still like Pellard.
Dude, that
But yeah,
happens
you
to my
nailed
name
it.
too. Like, I might have moved to Utah. People are like Adam Pillar. I'm like, what?
Yeah,
At Pillar? Yeah,
yeah,
weird.
but yeah, no, you nailed it. Josh Pelland. But Josh works as well. So
Cool. Well, Josh has a lot of Josh works with data driven strength, and you believe you work with Zach like in the same like lab with getting your is it your doctorate at this point, your PhD? Yeah, I
yep.
believe you're doing something with hypertrophy, whereas he's doing like proximity to failure, correct?
Uh, f- we have a lot of projects going on, so we kind of have like
Sure.
projects that the lab is kind of doing, and then we have like our own individual dissertations. So yeah, some of our recent research has been in the proximity to failure arena. Zach's dissertation research is specifically on individualization, which is a really cool project. And then my research for my dissertation will be on skeletal muscle resensitization, which is a fancy term there. So those are kind of our dissertation projects. But then we have, we also have like a volume study that should be out relatively soon, some muscle length research. So many, also a concurrent training paper that we're working on getting out the door. So many things kind of going on.
So actually going off of that, I'm curious about like the concurrent training thing because I think a lot of powerlifters, especially, they get very much in their head about doing any sort of cardio or any sort of like extra physical activity, outside of training and interfering with strength gains. And one thing I like to say is, well, look at the NFL athletes. They do lots of cardio, and they're arguably the biggest and strongest people right now. If you put any of those guys in strict powerlifting training, like they would absolutely blow up. So as
Mhm.
far as like concurrent training goes, I guess my biggest question there is like, what's the extent of like the interference effect with, say, something like cardio or higher step counts? Um, should powerlifters really be concerned about that, or is it mostly just a matter of if you're habituated to it, does your body kind of just figure things out?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a sliding scale of the interference effect, if that makes sense. But with any decision regarding the level of cardiovascular training you have, there's gonna be a give and a take, right? So like from a molecular perspective, you could say that the best approach to maximize your powerlifting performance or your muscle gain is going to be absolutely no cardiovascular training, and you should just be nearly sedentary to avoid any sort of interference effect between cardio and resistance training. But obviously, that just fails that just doesn't have any face validity to it. So I think it's like a sliding scale of like, we kind of need this background work capacity, which honestly I don't think that powerlifters need to do a ton of cardiovascular training, at least on average. But I think as coaches, being able to identify when that is a bottleneck to their training, I think that is an important thing to be able to notice and have strategies to implement it. And I think there are some relatively basic things that can be done to minimize the interference effect. Like we know that the interference effect is probably a local phenomenon primarily. So, maybe avoid doing like very intense cycling right after squatting, but very intense cycling right after bench press probably is less consequential. So, I don't think it's a must do for a powerlifter, but I think it can be a helpful tool at times.
Yeah, I do think having some basic level of cardiovascular fitness is necessary for health. And I think as far
Yep.
as powerlifting, I think that's essentially like if you're healthier, you're probably going to perform better. But
Yep.
I guess my main like, going off of that, obviously, I think you said a good thing is like intensity matters with how what you're doing. Do you think there's like a upper limit of like step counts where it might interfere with like say like leg adaptations?
Yeah. So it, I definitely can't like point to the research and say anything on that specifically regarding the influence of very high step counts on strength or hypertrophy outcomes. What I can say from a practical perspective is I think if you're pushing it too high, you'll know. um, is kind of been my experience, and I that's been relatively rare. I think you see some of uh, the greatest risk reduction in terms of mortality or death, as well as morbidity, which is basically just the occurrence of disease. Somewhere in that like 7 to 9,000 step per day range seems to be like where you're going to get the majority of the benefits. And like, man, if 7 to 9,000 steps per day is negatively influencing your powerlifting, there's probably some other issues going on. So I think from a practical perspective, high step counts are highly unlikely to negatively influence someone's powerlifting training, at least directly.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. I think the body's like pretty adaptable, especially with like, if it's low
100%.
low, low impact like walking, it's like your body probably just
Yeah.
adapts over time. And typically like from Pat Cali perspective, like what you said, you'll be getting tired.
Yeah.
Walking will be a stressful thing, and that's probably not good. But I
Yeah.
guess jetting off of this, I think that one thing I wanted to go over was individualizing back offset intensity, because this is something that I see a little more often with some of my lifters. Some people seem to operate at a pretty high average intensity and even respond pretty well to it. Other people seem to respond better to lower average in intensity. Um, and like for example, I had one of my athletes, Trevor. We were doing like 3x6s, single minus 25%, something like that. And he was just getting pretty fatigued from that. And I was like, well, kind of jetting off of what you guys said about, with your lower fatigue training, let's try doing like a 6x3 instead of a 3x6 with the same back offset intensity like reduction. And he started making as like the best progress he really ever has. So what do you, I guess, from a coaching perspective, what goes through your head when when we're evaluating back offset intensity? Because I think we know from the research, right, like top set intensity is what's going to be that primary driver, but we still need to have a certain amount of work to drive other characteristics of strength. Um, so I guess I'll let you go from there.
Yeah. This is a really interesting kind of discussion, and also one that I think circles around how my mind has changed since I think it was episode 15 when Zach and I were on a couple years ago. Um, I think before, and I think a lot of people still kind of have this mindset, is that people quote unquote respond to different training approaches, which I think is true. And I think any coach that is attentive is going to agree that, like, yes, different lifters quote unquote respond differently to different training approaches. But I think it's helpful, and I think this is particularly where the research can come in, is trying to understand why that's the case. I think some coaches, and again, myself in the past, will kind of just think like, oh, this is just better for them. And uh, we don't necessarily have an explanation. And I'm not saying that research can always provide an explanation, but instead it can give you a framework in terms of what is actually driving the response. What is the cost benefit analysis here? And as a result, you can kind of get to these creative solutions a little bit more efficiently. So, take the example of, I think you said like a top single followed by a 25% drop for a 3x6, right? So let's say that 3x6, I'd say for a lot of people with that drop, you're maybe talking about like RP7, RP8 for the back off, something like that, right? Um, what the research can kind of indicate to us is that, like, hey, the the actual RPE there isn't independently driving the effect in terms of the strength gain, right? We see that at a given load and at a given volume, the proximity to failure doesn't really drive the strength gains independently. That doesn't mean that you can train at RP -10 and maximize your strength gains, because obviously with a sufficient load on the bar and, just from a practical perspective, doing more than 1 or 2 reps per set for every single set you do, you're going to have to do multiple, you're going to have to train at a decent RPE. But you can take that concept and say, okay, that 3x6, that's leading to some negative some downstream effects on fatigue, and thus further downstream effects on the ability to tolerate future training, the peak intensity used next week, et cetera. And you can say, okay, what if we flip those sets and reps and do 6 sets of 3? And as a result, okay, same load, same total volume, and a lower RPE, which some people might tolerate a lot better. And boom, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. And I use that example because I think it's a good one of working backwards from what seems to actually drive strength. Um, and importantly, intraset fatigue, so just the amount of fatigue you accumulate within a set, seems to have basically no direct effect on strength gains, at least in the short term. Now, things might get a little bit complicated when you start to think about the role of hypertrophy over a longer time period, but at least in the relatively short term, and especially I think this is relevant for like your main SPD work because the goal there is to get better at the lift. And if you get some hypertrophy from it, awesome. But we're probably using other tools or other days to kind of really focus on the hypertrophy side of things. So we can say, okay, from the research, we see that intensity, which I would quibble with that terminology a little bit. And instead of intensity, I would just say load, because I think intensity can kind of mean a lot of different things to different
Yeah.
people. But, intensity kind of from a textbook definition is percentage of 1 RM. Again, I prefer that term of load. That seems to uh, drive strength gains, and particularly peak intensity seems to drive strength gains. Again, intraset fatigue or the RPE you train at when you're at a given load does not seem to really matter. And then volume, we're going to have a pretty robust analysis coming out on this within the next couple months. But volume for strength gains seems to be important to some degree, but not this thing that you need to maximize at all costs. So it's like, okay, we need sufficient volume and we need sufficient intensity or sufficient load. And importantly, and I think this is something that can help from a research communication and implementation perspective, is that um, just because higher volumes might be better on average, or higher peak intensities or average intensities, or again, peak loads or average loads are better on average, does not mean that sliding down that scale towards lower volumes or lower peak loads or lower average loads is going to lead to no strength gains, right? And again, we need to basically, to answer your question, how do I think about back off prescription, especially in terms of the load used, is I'm going to say, okay, in a vacuum, probably what's best for the strength stimulus is to do like 30 singles at a 10 RPE. But obviously, that's not going to be realistic from like a psychological perspective, from a fatigue management perspective, and from, and thus as a result, accumulating sufficient volume. So I kind of work backwards from there and say, okay, we need to do more than probably 1 rep per set to make things efficient in terms of getting some volume in. And we want to use kind of the heaviest load we can sustain. And then we can adjust the reps per set based on this balance of like efficiency, because higher reps per set are going to be a little bit more efficient. Lower reps per set, a lot of people will kind of tolerate a little bit better. And then we can individualize that back off prescription. So for some folks, that might mean, okay, they have no problem handling 85% for their back off bench work, and they can do a bunch of doubles or triples or something like that with their back off work for bench. Awesome. That's probably going to be, a really good strength stimulus, and based on the research, a really good approach. However, that's just not going to be something that's tolerable or sustainable for a lot of people, especially if they're benching, 4 or 5 times per week. So you kind of work backwards from there and you say, okay, maybe 70 to 75% is kind of the sweet spot at this point in the week, because, their elbows don't hurt 48 hours later for their next bench session. And, they're able to accumulate volume a little bit more efficiently. And then on the other extreme is like, I have some guys, and this tends to be people that just have a higher absolute strength, is you can really go down those lower intensities just because that is the only thing that allows them to get insufficient volume, right? Like I have one guy that's approaching a 700-pound squat right now, and I just programmed his kind of final weeks going into a meet right now, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. Um, but for him, man, like we're doing percentage based stuff, and like he's rarely touching, for his back off work at least, he's rarely touching above 60%. And like again, would it theoretically be optimal to use 80 or 85%, 100%? But like he's just going to crash and burn if that's the case, and fatigue is going to completely make the block fizzle out, make us have to reset, etc. And again, we see these relationships that the research can kind of give us insight into, and then we can work backwards from there from a practical perspective and kind of move the chess pieces around on the playing board, if you will, which is in this case the client's program.
I think that's a really interesting perspective because, I think it comes down to like where are you most stable in terms of performance on a week to week basis, when you are driving that. And the reality is that I like what you said about how it could be different on different days depending on what sort of fatigue is most prominent. This is, with working with Zordos, the DUP Lord, I guess you can call him that. That's sort of what allows you to do is basically overload different systems because they're a little bit less fatigued. And so say like one day in the week you're doing, like for example with my squat like program right now, it's I seem to respond a little bit better in average to like lower average and like intensities and doing like more volume in general. That's where I seem to have the most momentum. And you can really see this on like say if I'm doing like a singles block or doing sets of like 3 to 5, my output and volume is just higher. I can perform more work. It's more easy to maintain momentum on that. Like I did like a set of 4 with 474 for like RP7, and like for the single like 7 it might be like 518. It's because like I'm just not as skilled at it, but that drives more strength means I can be better at it. And then as far as like back off intensity, it's kind of weird because like I think as a coaches, like it's important to be athletes in this case because I think that's kind of like intuitive what you said. The stronger that you get, you can't have the same like absolute intensity on your down sets because it tends to be more and more fatiguing neurologically from that top set on the heavier that you go. And like I don't even think about like RPE for myself personally. Like Eric writes on my sheet like 5 at 6 and 7. I kind of ignore that, and to be honest with you, I just go on how much like how hard does it need to like feel? How much volume do I actually need to handle? Especially with like what is I think of like what's also going to be stable from like a technique perspective on their
Yep.
downsets, because I think that's really important to emphasize on downsets. I don't want to see technique break down really at all. I think those top sets though they should be challenging that technique because that's actual like technique training. But um and then it just is like for myself too. When I'm looking over like the overall microcycle, like frequency does matter too. I like what you said there. And like especially like higher frequency bench programs, I find the average intensity is just lower because you can't
Yeah.
handle as much work day after day after day. So maybe instead of maybe you're deadlifting once per week, you can handle like 80+% pretty stably. But maybe that has to shift if you're doing twice a week or on bench press, more maybe it's 65 to 75%. Like Sean Noriega talked about this in my live podcast. It's just like identifying like where is the athlete most stable at? Where can they have the most momentum? And then going off of like how do they feel? I think you mentioned like one thing with like downstream effects too, of like maybe you get more sore from those sets of 6, which is what's Trevor's thing, and he just wasn't like recovering as well. So maybe we just do lower reps because we know that's going to be less. It's obviously hypertrophy occurs across all rep ranges, but the most want to be more biased neurologically as opposed to having more of a skew with um muscular demands. So yeah, I know I rambled on a little bit there, but this just comes
No,
down
I
to
think
communicating like with the athlete and just saying like where are they most stable, what like where do they feel good too? Is nobody wants to feel like I think it's an important thing like not have your training feel like overly hard.
mhm.
Like that psychological stress is going to impact fatigue a lot.
Yeah, kind of what I'm picking up, and I agree with basically everything you said. Is like you got to keep the goal a goal of a given slot. So like a secondary squat day for you is like one of the primary goals is to get some additional practice with the movement, right? And yeah, is using 80% plus going to be a little bit better practice potentially, but 67.5%, like that's still some practice, you know? And what's more important within the grand scheme of things is going to be showing up to that primary day feeling at least mostly recovered to be able to express strength pretty well. Because again, that peak load or peak percentage of 1RM seems to be one of the primary factors that leads to positive strength gains. And I think that can kind of explain a lot, basically every concept that you talked about here, right? Like where does an athlete kind of groove in terms of percentage of 1RM is what you said. Like, um, some people maybe kind of a lankier squatter, they see more technique breakdown at a given percentage of 1RM, like maybe 75% of 1RM, you're starting to see some knee slide a little bit. And that those kind of breakdowns in technique, if you will, they aren't inherently injurious or like inherently dangerous by any means, but it might kind of lower the ceiling in terms of what the lifter can recover from throughout the week, and again, show up for in that primary day feeling good to be able to have a decent peak load throughout the week. So I think we can take these concepts that, again, momentum matters, and kind of these subjective things about like just like grooving in the protocols, not overexerting yourself from a psychological perspective 4 times a week because you're a 4 time per week bencher, and allow that primary data to kind of drive things, and then everything else kind of fit around that and check the boxes you're looking at. Check the boxes you're trying to check from a program design perspective.
I think one thing I've noticed too, anecdotally, is range of motion is probably the one thing that impacts like how heavy you typically train at. I feel like when you mentioned that lankier squatter, I'm a lanky boy. Like my bench press is like I have lanky arms. Like my deadlift isn't even like very efficient. Like it's pretty like long range of motion. My average intensity has to be rather low. Whereas with people that maybe they are very efficient, someone deadlifter, maybe they can operate and be more stable at those higher percentages of 1 rep max because they're doing less work per set.
Yeah, I think the range of motion concept is like I fully agree with you. However, I don't think it's range of motion itself that's driving this observation. To be clear, this is my opinion, and like I don't know this for sure to be the case, but I think probably what's a more likely explanation for this is just the individual's leverages for that lift, uh, and that seems to be related to range of motion, right?
Yeah.
Who are some of the best power lifters in their weight class? Guys on the shorter end, and they're going to have a lower or reduced range of motion, and they're going to have really good leverages for the lift. And as a result, dude, I'm 6'4". I got femurs for days, and I'm just not going to be able to handle the same workload as someone that's also 225, which is how much I weigh, and isn't 6'4", but they're 5'8", and they just look like a big meatball, and their leverages just allow them to sink into a squat nice and easy. Like, yeah, on average, someone that's more like my archetype is probably going to be be able to check those boxes we've talked about with a lower percentage of 1RM, maybe a different volume allocation between the main lift and some of their accessory work compared to just this person that's built for powerlifting. And I think you mentioned Mike Sordos, who is my PhD advisor, and he's the principal investigator in the lab I work in. Um, and this kind of DUP approach is relatively specific, also pretty high frequency as well, especially for the squat and deadlift. And I think the people that respond best to that are people that are built to powerlift, to be honest. And then I think that people that are less built to powerlift, whose leverages aren't quite as favorable, those are the people that require kind of working backwards from, these optimal approaches on paper, and then you start to look at these weird programs where, or not weird in a bad way, but I should say like creative or just like unique programs of like, okay, we're doing like 3 sets of squat per week, and then the rest is on belt squat with a heel elevation, right? Or not touching above 70% of 1RM until the last week of the block, right? Like those are relatively extreme examples, but at least in my experience, those are people that have high absolute strength and people that aren't necessarily built to powerlift is just been my observation. And again, that seems to, at least the latter one of not built to powerlift, seems to also kind of correlate with a greater range of motion.
I think that's a great point. I think like that's actually one of the main reasons like why I think a lot of powerlifters struggle until they get a coach, because most of those those free powerlifting programs, they're built for like just assuming, oh yeah, you're built to powerlift.
Yeah.
But the more that you kind of coach, you kind of realize like it's great to start from like where the science says and what most people respond well to, but you know, averages like aren't coaching. You're not working with
Yeah.
averages in most cases. And I've seen the most funny things work for people. I've had to challenge a lot of my own beliefs with like myself with like my own programming and like, this is just
Yeah.
like, so I'm not built for the sport necessarily, but like, I think that comes down to like, I think a really good marker, like a good coach is having that ability to like just challenge what they kind of like believe to be like, this is what's optimal, this is what works the best.
Mhm.
Sean, I mean, I'm mentioning Sean again, but he said like one of the main things that the people are like, oh, I'm not making progress. It's like you just haven't exhausted all your options, and like
Yeah.
you maybe need to like expand
100%.
your coaching tool belt. I think a good example of this is Charlie Dixon because like when he was starting out, from what he told me and what Brad Couillard told me is like it was very like typical DUP, high volume, and like he did
Yeah.
make lots of progress on it, but it also resulted in him getting hurt. And his programming is completely different now, much lower volume, lower intensity, and he's healthiest he's been in a long time. So
Yeah.
I know that you mentioned, we talk about, muscle growth is an important part of powerlifting. Um, but I think that, there's ways to incorporate in different programs in a way that's going to not interfere as much with strength, because we do know that excessive muscle damage is going to interfere with strength. Also, hypertrophy tends to operate a little better. You get better growth from what you're sort of pushing volume in my experience, whereas strength, and you can, if I'm wrong, doesn't need as much volume and operates a little better in lower fatigue environments. How would you sort of say you have somebody in like a 12-week meet prep, but then they're going on up a weight class, they're trying to build some muscle, but they're also trying to like peak for a meet at the end. How would you maybe periodize that over time, or how should we as athletes and coaches, think about this relationship with strength and hypertrophy in our programming, and maybe with like a psychological approach to like how we approach exercises in different phases of training?
Yeah, this is I guess I'll start by saying this is a big question, right? I'm sure we could chat about this for 2 or 3 hours and I guess from a scientific perspective, I'd be remiss to not mention that this is like a raging debate and people have different perspectives. Things get really, really nuanced because you start thinking about how exactly is muscle measured, right? You put an ultrasound probe on someone's quad and it's like, yeah, that's obviously an indication of the muscle size of their quad, but also you're putting the probe at one spot, right? We know that different regions of the muscle might contribute to a given movement a little bit more than another. And hey, maybe this individual's squat isn't quite as quote unquote quaddy as someone else's. We also know that, hey, just looking at the muscle size on something like an ultrasound or an MRI, that is the whole muscle size. That's not always indicative, and I would say is not all is not necessarily indicative of the actual size of the contractile proteins or the abundance of the contractile proteins that are contributing to strength. So that's the scientist in me just making sure I cross my T's and dot my I's regarding the uncertainty here. But in the example of a 12-week training cycle going into a meet, it's like, okay, someone's in a surplus and you simultaneously want to improve their body composition, so increase muscle mass while simultaneously making sure they're at kind of peak performance by the end of the 12-week training cycle. I think it really depends on training advancement here, and how targeted the lifter has been with their training in the past. Because I think when we're thinking about the role of hypertrophy and strength development, it's important to keep in mind that, you know, getting bigger biceps or bigger lateral delts or rear delts, like that's not going to do a whole lot for SPD. What matters is primarily the prime movers. And if I think there is a very high likelihood that I can develop a training approach for this individual that is going to improve the hypertrophy response of the prime movers, I'm probably going to lean very hard into that for almost the entire 12-week training cycle. And like tapers can be really simple. They can be like a week or half a week, and you can see a pretty good response. I don't think you need to do anything super fancy. And I think you can have a pretty polarized approach in that case. So you can have like, you know, 1 to 4 sets of the main lift. That's relatively heavy, and then you can just go target those prime movers again. If I think that individual has a high likelihood of putting on meaningful muscle mass over a 12-week period, and specifically in the areas that I identify as their quote unquote strength limiter. And this is something that's kind of new in my and Zach and Jake and Drake, which are all of our coaches here, are thinking is yes, the prime movers of each lift are important to grow, but also um, every lifter is probably going to have a muscle or muscles that are going to kind of give out first at a top end, right? So you can look at training footage, and ideally it's heavy loads, and it's either like a weight they just missed, so they don't get the rep, but it was like really close, or they just barely got. And you can look at how they move to get some indication regarding what muscles were kind of the quote unquote weak point. So like if I have someone who, again, I think I look at their squat and I'm like, those quads are just completely given out, and they can't even get out of the hole at all. We're seeing a little bit of knee slide, and then they just boom, they dump the bar and they can't get it. And their training beforehand was just not very good for quad growth. It's like, man, we could probably do some damage in terms of quad growth over these 12 weeks. We're going to put a lot of effort into that. But then on the other side, it's like, okay, I have someone that's been following that sort of approach. If I've been working with them for years, and it's like, okay, we have 12 weeks to maximize this individual strength. It's like, I don't know how much muscle growth we're going to see over the next 12 weeks, my friend. And we're probably better off making sure we're really focused on the rhythm going into the meet, um, timing up like the heaviest exposures to make sure that we can strike when the iron's hot on the platform. And that might come with kind of a slight reduction in like the hypertrophy work that the individual is doing, but just enough to maintain. So those were kind of the extremes, right? Like someone that I think can see a lot of muscle growth over the 12 weeks, and then someone that is unlikely to see a lot of muscle growth over the 12 weeks. But obviously, a lot of people are going to kind of be in the middle there, and that would kind of lead to how I would describe my general periodization approach over the course of a training cycle, and that is to periodize the interset fatigue throughout the training cycle. So again, interset fatigue is just like, okay, you have a given weight on the bar. Um, how how fatigued are you at the end of the set compared to when you started the set? So when you were fresh, right? And for hypertrophy, so that is almost identical to just proximity to failure or RPE. So a higher interset fatigue would mean a closer proximity to failure and higher RP. It's not the exact same thing, but more or less it is the same thing. And what we see for hypertrophy is that proximity to failure seems to matter a good amount. And but we also know, like you mentioned, it's like, okay, the training a little bit closer to failure might be a little bit harder to recover from. Um, and as a result, you might sacrifice your primary day performance to some degree, right? You would want to set it up so you minimize that sacrifice, but you're probably going to have to sacrifice that to some degree. But we'll take that trade-off early on in the cycle because the goal isn't necessarily to maximize top end strength right here, right now, this week, right? The meet is in 10 weeks. Let's make sure we're setting ourselves up for success then. But then later in the cycle, it's like, okay, at this point, any additional hypertrophy we get, sure, that would be great, but like that's not the primary goal. The primary goal right now is to make sure you're in the best possible position to get some good practice going into the meet and taper well. So at that point, I don't care about the intercept fatigue all that much, right? And if anything, like we discussed before, by reducing the intercept fatigue, so think doing doubles instead of sixes for your back offs, and maybe as a result using slightly heavier loads. That's going to potentially provide a recovery benefit, so that by the time you circle back around to your primary day, you feel better, you can get better rhythm going into the meet. And again, at this point, we're so close to the meet that should kind of be the priority. So as a result, you kind of see this decrease in average RPE for kind of the back off work or the hypertrophy accessory type work across the training cycle. I also think you can periodize the psychological approach, right? Based on the goal of the week you're in or the block you're in, right? Early on, again, that RP for kind of the back off work or the hypertrophy work might be higher. And also you can say, hey, obviously bring a lot of focus to your comp squat this week. But like, dude, those hack squats you're doing or those belt squats you're doing, like arguably those are more important. Just make sure you don't sandbag those. Make sure that if anything, bring more juice to that accessory work. And then you can kind of flip that later in the cycle, right? Because again, you kind of only have so much that you can bring a lot of juice to. So you kind of got to pick your spots. And I think that creates kind of this nice starting point, at least from a conceptual perspective, in terms of how interset fatigue, which often manifests in average RP, can change throughout a training cycle and specifically kind of decrease to shift that focus from the hypertrophy side of things more towards the top end strength expression side of things.
So do you think that like maintaining volume as you do lower down the intercept fatigue and say like you're close to meet, does that matter, or can you kind of like get like a benefit for like a taper as that kind of happens, like the intensity maybe in like the volume on the downsets?
Yeah, my honest answer, man, is I don't know, and I kind of go back and forth on this. So like one option is to say like, okay, we're going to reduce the back offset average RPE, maintain or increase load slightly, and as a result, you could do more sets, right? So you could go like, let's just use like an isolated example. You could go 3 sets of 6 on a slot early on in the block, or sorry, early on in the cycle, and then later in the cycle, do you go, you know, maybe bump the load up a little bit? Do you go 3 sets of 3, or do you go 6 sets of 3, right? Because the latter is actually maintaining your training volume, whereas the former is like reducing the training volume, and as a result, probably reducing fatigue even further. With reducing volume, I have run into the problem of just the lifter feeling out of practice because they have less total reps with the lift. So that's probably like the biggest thing to be wary of. So I would say my starting point is to use about 85%, so damn near the same volumes we were using before, even when that intercept fatigue is reduced, because maintaining sufficient practice seems to help. But again, also reducing the volume, you might see a slight benefit um, from a recovery perspective and fatigue management perspective. So it seems to be pretty individual. Like I'm thinking of my client roster. I have some people where I would not touch their volume within like 4 days of them stepping on the platform. And then I have other guys that are like, yeah, let's cut that thing down to 50%. And we know we're going to see some benefit from that. So seems to vary a good amount.
Yeah, I have my perspective on that, because I was like I go back and forth on this too. Like in my own training, I've observed that as long as like I'm maintaining like my intensity, like on my down sets, like that are similar to like say that those say I was doing like higher reps or whatever, like I tend to be okay if I'm reducing the volume. However, if I'm lowering down the intercept like fatigue as we do that, I think that's important to maintain the total amount of work done in general, because it's like I think you risk changing a little bit too much, because I think this comes back to like the effective reps concept too. Or like you want to maintain those effective reps, and maybe with sets of 6, your effective reps are 3, and then maybe as you go and you get heavier ability, you're maintaining that, the intensity is going up. And personally, I think that's what matters for strength, and that's how I sort of track it. Um, but I also think it's like you said, it can be it's nuanced,
Yeah.
and it just depends on where the lifter again like feels most stable. Is we can always talk about these theoretical concepts, and I think it's important in these podcasts to do that. But ultimately, this comes down to your ability to actually coach and your ability to communicate with the athlete, and ask
Mm-hmm.
like how do they feel, what's most psychologically fun for them. Because like for somebody like myself, I come from a bodybuilding background. If like I have like really easy down sets, it's just like if it's on, it depends on the exercise, but like it has to be like again like a certain like amount of hard I have to like maintain throughout
Yeah.
the training block. And if that like leaves too much, it's like I'm changing a little bit too much. I also think that also comes down to, I think you can make that up with the average intensity, like with the accessory work. Like if you're having like lower average or like intensity on your downsets like a squat, you probably should push your accessories better. This is probably the reason why you have lower average intensities, because you're not well leveraged for that, and you can't really like you can't really like
Yeah.
have benefit from it the same. I like how you said like through like identifying like is this does this athlete have like actual strength limiter from a muscular like perspective. That's really like limiting them, and then maybe that dictates how much we bias towards having that higher intraset fatigue on accessories or whatnot. I mean, you can obviously look like a body weight, but I think everybody's going to have that the muscle group regardless that kind of like gives out if they have like certain pattern. So
Yeah.
um I know barbell medicine also has like a perspective, and I don't think this is like inaccurate at all either. Like training that gets you stronger in the long run, as long as your volume is like sufficient with the in most powerlifting programs, you're probably gonna have at least 10 sets per week per muscle group. You're probably
Hmm.
going to be able to maximize muscle growth over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think this. Uh, you mentioned Charlie, who I think is a part of barbell medicine, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know about that anecdote specifically, but I'll just refer to it here because I know you mentioned it because that resonated a lot with me because that's something I noticed as well is that things seem to need to get more targeted later in a training career. And like, yeah, 10 sets of squats per week for someone that's been training for less than whatever, 5, 6, 7 years is almost certainly going to be plenty. But I've definitely observed I'm a human being. My ability to determine causality from an observational perspective is as limited as anyone else's. But it seems to be the case that things need to be more targeted as you get more advanced. And there might be a time when doing 10 sets of squats per week is just not going to lead to any meaningful muscle growth over a long enough time period. Like I feel pretty confident saying that for at least for some people. Now again, you take the person that's built to squat and like they see some good a good stretch on their quads at the bottom of the squat and it's very tolerable, etc. That's a totally different story than again maybe we take someone that's less built to squat and having them actually do some volume on a exercise that allows them to get a deep stretch in their quads and then they put 50 pounds in their squat over the next calendar year. Like I've just seen that enough times to take it seriously. And I just think it becomes a different ball game when you take someone that's been doing that for years and years and years and just kind of hit this asymptote of strength. I think you got to identify the weak link. Sometimes it's technical, oftentimes it's muscular, and make things very targeted from that perspective.
I think a good way to know, like, like if that's actually like enough volume or not, like, with what you said is like when they gain weight, are they gaining muscle or is it like mostly just fat? Because, whenever you're gaining weight, you have to remember the training is the reason why you're building muscle. And, if you're just not building muscle like where you want it, or, see, I'm kind of
Mm-hmm.
just getting fatter, maybe you do actually need to increase the volume over time.
Yeah,
Because, especially because, the average, you can have the volume pretty damn low and see pretty robust strength gains. If you have muscle to like, be able to like carry you there
yeah,
without like really noticing, okay, I'm actually like looking better, or I know my body composition looks about the same when I'm 5 pounds up.
yeah.
But I do think like my own bias is like my own coaching perspective is like I really push accessories because I just
Mm-hmm.
find it's that if you can get more volume, it's more recoverable. It just tends to also be like really fun for a lot
Yeah.
of people. I've actually seen less injury rates with even having more movement variability, and that's a huge part of my coaching system. And I think you see with some coaching systems that are really emphasize that specificity,
Mm-hmm.
you get more banged up, and that impacts a training career over time. And as somebody like
Yeah.
who comes with an athletic training background, rehab is a big part of like what I think about. Like I really think about long term and what's going to keep this athlete healthy in the long run, because you can do a lot of extreme things in the short term and you might
Mm-hmm.
really see really good progress, but over the long run, is that going to result in you need to rehab for 6 months, a year,
Mm-hmm.
and backsliding?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I think I agree with basically everything you said. Um, I also would just I know we probably got to wrap up here, but the last thing I'll say to kind of underscore what you just said here is like I also just think that humans are very adaptable, and fatigue management is vital, as we've mentioned multiple times here. But I think back to my days as a very average basketball player, right? Playing like varsity ball during parts of the year and then like AAU ball during other parts of the year, and probably playing basketball in some capacity on average for like 15 hours a week, and also doing like strength conditioning on top of that. And like, hey, sometimes I'd also have a baseball tournament in there. It's like, I just think back to, granted, I had basically no life stressors at the time, but I think we sometimes uh, fail to account for what we can adapt to, especially when it's targeted and controlled to some degree, right? Like, sure, someone might never be able to tolerate 20 sets of squats per week, but I don't know, man. One of my clients just sent me a an old magazine that his wife's dad had, because his wife's dad used to be a bodybuilder. And like, you look at some of those protocols. Now, granted, there's additional supplementation there that probably is playing a role. But like, man, those training protocols were pretty extreme. And if you gradually build up to something, and of course understand that fatigue management matters, I think what you can recover from and benefit from can be higher than a lot of people think, and also just make you more resilient.
Yeah, I think this is a good example with like, well, my coaching system. I give my beginners lots of high intensity singles because they're so new. I also, because I want them, they can adapt to that. I want them also learn how to like work hard.
Yeah.
And I think like that's one of the things that I did well. My first like, I trained really hard. Like I did really heavy top sets. I trained just like an idiot, but I adapted to it, and I really learned how
Yeah.
to like train. And like that's also like why I can grind really well. I think there's like a
Yep.
skill, like there's a lot of value in learning how to push, and we are more adaptable than we do think. And I think that it's valuable as an athlete. Although look at some of the like I think like proximity to failure. The most extreme example is like John Hack. He can train RP 9.510 and still adapt, and that's how he gets his best response. I have some athletes like that too. They just respond really well at that peak load. Um,
Mhm.
and you need to be willing to like psychologically, like I love that. Like I love that. I don't like easy sets. And like
Mhm.
on like my squat, I actually respond a little better to that. It's also like psychological, and you kind
Yeah.
of need to just you need to try lots of different things. And fatigue matters. Like fatigue management does matter, but I think people get too worried about fatigue at the expense of working
Mhm.
hard.
Yeah. I
My
mean,
personal
basically,
experience.
I think probably a good uh, mental model here for the listeners, like take everything that we talked about throughout this podcast, but then just like make sure that that is on top of the foundation of like not pussyfooting around, and knowing how to train hard. And um because it's like, I use the example of like one of my lifters where we don't touch above, whatever, 60, 70% until the last week of a block. And it's like, yeah, but like you should see how hard he's going on his accessories. And you know, we mentioned concurrent training. That individual happens to also be doing a lot of interval type work right now, and some steady state work as well, because having some energy for deadlift on the platform has been an issue in the past, right? So it's like there's just no way around training hard, and but then when you have that kind of foundation, you say, okay, where are we going to allocate that effort, right?
I
And where are we going to ensure those principles are being accounted for? And then you move those chess pieces around based on what the individual needs and what you've observed from them in the past.
I think a good way to like frame the science-based training, it's how do I most efficiently train hard? It's not a way to
Mhm.
train easier. It's how do I most efficiently train hard?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
you're going to have to work hard. There's no way around it.
Yeah, and identifying, because when something has to give, what is not what is the least likely thing to be contributing to a positive response, right? And if you know those concepts, and I've kind of changed my mind about, or not changed my mind, but shifted my mindset around the role of research, I'd say over the last 4 or 5 years, is that the goal is to understand the physiological concepts through studies that are as internally valid as possible. Like, I don't think the goal is necessarily to test microcycle configuration A to microcycle configuration B. It's like, I think if we understand the concepts, the coach is more than well equipped to handle those things, right? Instead, I care about what seem to be the variables. What's the dose response relationship between variable A and outcome B, right? Is that a linear dose response where theoretically the more that variable is cranked up, there's no there's going to be a benefit from a physiological perspective? Or is it diminishing returns, right? Do you see a strong benefit from going from 4 to 8 sets, but then that really tapers off after that on average? Or again, is that a completely linear response? Or is it an inverted U where there's a point of too much and then you actually see a diminished response? And then once we have those concepts, that's ultimately how you can determine where to allocate the effort. And if something has to give, where are we pulling from first?
I think that's a great way to end things off. So thank you for coming
Perfect.
on Josh. If people want to follow you, hire you, where should they head?
Yeah, I'd say the best way to keep in touch with us is if you go to my Instagram, josh.datadrivenstrength, you can give me a follow and check out my link tree. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is probably the best way to keep in touch with us and kind of be updated on what we're doing. Also, in my link tree in my Instagram, there's a link to my research gate, so you can check out the research that I've been a part of that's out there, and then that'll also be the place where new research is put as well.
Great. Well, make sure I include all those things in the show notes. And thank you again for coming on, Josh. And thanks to everybody for listening. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.